we have a great global panel. So I think we have also a great global audience. So if you feel like sharing where you are in the world, please put that in. We are very excited to have you here for the Space Between Climate Exchange webinar. The Space Between was created so that we can look at climate discourse and how we can work together and collaborate by looking at the interesting conversations that are happening both locally, regionally, and globally, and how we can really take those threads across great journalists in the world and start to look at stories on climate from all sides and all perspectives, and how something that has such huge impact globally, we can start to make a real ecosystem difference with. And with that said, I just want to say thank you to our regional partners. We have some great partners. We've got Winifera in Southeast Asia. We've got WITS in Africa and Report for the World in Europe. And so together with them, we are collaborating on sort of shifting this, the media ecosystem and including more of a climate language into it, we hope. And with that said, we have a wonderful panel today with us. So we've got Albano from GMA Philippines. We've got Mercy Abang from Unbias the News based in Berlin, Europe. And we've got Frederick Mugira, who is from InfoNile and water journalists in Africa. So they will share some of their amazing experiences and stories about community and climate with you shortly. Before we do that, we just wanted to touch on why we picked this subject of community. And we think that in terms of how you harness a community for storytelling, can be a really potent and very wonderful way to start to look at what topics resonate with communities and what insights can be gleaned so we can start to build the relevancy of climate, not only globally, but also locally across the world. And then also the conversation today hopefully will touch on around what community looks like in journalism. So how do we start to build those relationships with community, and how has community changed in terms of how we work together and harnessing that voice? You know, moving away from where it used to be just purely local community, we now obviously have interest-based communities online who are being given a voice. And so how do we look to harness that community voice across all types of media? And then also, how do we look at those collaborations and really bring that to life in the work that we do? And then how does it inform both creator and newsroom strategy, using, you know, the local voice for a global subject? We also want to hopefully touch on today how journalism can empower community groups and local interest groups, and how factual information and contextualization is something of real importance to us at this stage in terms of working with community. So hopefully we'll touch on all those points today. And without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Mercy, who please introduce yourself and share one of your wonderful case studies and the work that you've been doing. Thank you.
Hi, Sharon, and everyone joined us and the panelists. I'm happy to be here. And this is quite an interesting topic. I work with Unbias the News. And in 2022, we did launch an interesting project called the Sinking Cities Project. And what we did with that project was to examine how communities, cities are preparing for sea level rise. So what we did was to put in a team of journalists from Dublin, Rotterdam, Alexandria in Egypt, Lagos in Nigeria, Karachi, Dakar together. So pretty much the idea was to connect, train, and publish, you know, a report around climate issues. But we wanted specifically to work with local journalists in this community. So for instance, if you're based in any other city that isn't the cities I have mentioned, you might probably be one of the best journalists, but it wasn't the criteria to be on that team, because we really wanted to have an opportunity where we worked with local journalists who were able to cover how sea levels and coastal flooding caused by climate change threatened these cities. So, for instance, some of the questions that observers and some of our readers have asked why Karachi? Why is Karachi, in this topic? And for those who are not aware, Karachi is a city in Pakistan. Karachi is proceeding ahead of full speed with construction that blocks drainage, for instance, where dozens or even hundreds are killed in yearly floods that we have seen in the media. Why Dublin? In Ireland, there's been ongoing new developments to be built in areas soon to be below sea level rise. And some of their case studies are also case studies that we thought was important for these journalists to come together and partner in a way where they are going to be learning. So for instance, the person who is reporting for Lagos is able to see and study what is happening in Dublin and perhaps, add it to their investigation and their reportage in a way that, brings in a solution angle to the climate reportage as well. Officials, we wanted to also understand what officials in Alexandria in Egypt were doing to prepare for flooded coastlines, because almost like Lagos, Alexandria in Egypt, the concerns are almost similar. When buildings are already collapsing, at the highest rate in Egypt, we thought it was really important. And we've seen the same, concerns in cities like Lagos, so the investigation, the researching, the trainings was specifically that, all of these journalists are able to sit together to present or to look at how not just gain learnings, participate, but also to understand, to have a deep knowledge of this level of cross-border investigation that seeks to determine why threatened cities, rather than preparing, appear to be building expensive sandcastles that will topple into the ocean, So I think that was one of our major investigation or projects carried out on climate reporting that if I can say so myself, that stands out as one of our profound projects on this subject. And it's been when the stories was published in all of these countries, and also first, of course, on Unbiased News, thanks to our republication partners, it got a lot of visibility and reactions, even from local non-governmental organizations. So for instance, the story from Lagos had an NGO that was focused on climate reporting suing the state government when the story was out, because they wanted to understand what the government was doing to prepare, for the times that we are in. And perhaps transparency around, the issues on climate reportage around Lagos. I mean, Lagos is a city of an estimated 22 million people. So it was a major concern. It just takes 10 to 20 minutes of rainfall in Lagos for the almost half of the city to be flooded. Sometimes people in hundreds are killed, die from flooding, So it was an issue that needed to look at the imminent sea level rise, offer training, offer networking, because the idea of climate reporting as well, over time, we've seen that individual journalists and freelancers work in isolation of themselves. We wanted to be able to put everybody together to see that these issues might be different from government to government in your own part of the cities. These issues might be different from city to city, but they are all together, Climate issues has nothing to do with border controls, no visa restrictions. Rather, it's something that unites us as members of the global communities. So these journalists work together, investigated these issues, asked the right questions, asked the officials, asked the people also in these localities, and were able to come up with this investigation, in comparing these cities, connecting it. And this, I just needed to also add that Dublin is also, in this story for an important reason. So Dublin in a way represents the global north, while, most of the other cities are also in the global south. To be able to present them new ideas that they got in the course of the investigation and the researching, so it can be useful in more than one place, So whatever the people in Dublin are doing, adapting to, or the learnings that they have, somebody who is a journalist in Karachi is able to understand it, is able to ask these kinds of questions and also represent these kinds of issues in their reportage. And thankfully, it got us, the story and the project got us an award, which we're very excited about. But we also saw the power of putting together the cross-border team. We also saw the power of working, not allowing journalists to often work in isolation. Also, the training allowed these journalists to get a deeper sense of these issues, because it's easy to say, oh, well, I'm a journalist, I understand these issues, or I cover climate beats, as a reporter. But then when you now deeper and you get resource persons training you and telling you, these are the climate issues, it opens you up into a completely new dimension. This is no longer an event-based, kind of storytelling where I say, perhaps Sharon talks about something on climate and I go and write it. No, rather, it is more in-depth, it is more analytical, it is more investigative, it is also more comparative, where you can also see other case studies that you have learnings from, and perhaps on learning as well, to be able to provide, a proper reportage and an explainer that allows for informed choices, especially for the policymakers, because it helped a local NGO to be able to push for, to approach the court and ask for, a better transparency around climate reportage.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think the points that you brought up around sort of cross-border and breaking down those borders, and how actually then policy can start to be changed by the power of that collective community, is really interesting. And Frederick, I saw you nodding along there. Perhaps you would be so kind as to share some of your experiences this and your case study that highlights that, and other things as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually think it's almost the same stuff. The way we do, the way we cover, the way we work with the journalists, it's almost the same stuff. Just to give you a background, so I founded Water Journalists Africa. We have, for example, InfoNile, which is a geojournalism project, specifically focusing on the Nile Basin. There are 11 countries in the Nile Basin, like River Nile and where it flows. And also we have a project called apes reporting, project that, reports about apes, conservation issues about the apes in 21 countries in Africa. So almost like what has been said, in 2020, we worked with a group of, 18 journalists in Eastern Africa to report just one story, one theme of why lakes in Eastern Africa are shrinking. If you looked at the map probably and you did 10 years ago, you'd see that most of the lakes in Eastern Africa are shrinking. So we put together a team of 18 journalists who produced 12 stories, 1 to 12 stories. And these stories were published by 30 media houses in the region, in Eastern Africa. And so we worked with the journalists, the 18 journalists. We wanted to specifically do a collaborative piece, because like what has been mentioned already, climate is a transboundary, you could call it a transboundary resource. It's everywhere. And if you did look at the microclimate of the Eastern Africa, it's almost the same. It's especially what happens in Ethiopia, for example, is likely to happen. If you have floods in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Tanzania, they are likely also to be in Uganda. So then you would say this is just like the same microclimate. So we focused on those lakes, and we did 12 stories, and so we used the different techniques, but specifically for us, we do geojournalism. We tell stories using data generated by Earth sciences. So we had one theme running through shrinking lakes. And then we worked with the journalists and trained some of them in geojournalism. So we used different techniques, like I said, like the use of satellite imagery, for example. We did mapping, we juxtaposed, wanted to show what was happening. We used techniques like time lapse to show what was happening and how, it was before, how these lakes are shrinking, and drone imagery, different techniques, but specifically we focus on data journalism. We do data journalism, so wanted to make sure that we engage, and we engage local data, like you work with local scientists, or when you work with local journalists, they are able to get you local data. For example, data of their villages, their communities, on the local level, probably not on the international level. Yeah, so then we were able to produce these stories. And actually, our project was shortlisted for an award by the Covering Climate Now. We didn't get it last year, but it was shortlisted. Probably next time we'll do another project and it wins. But we realized that most of these lakes were shrinking because one of the reasons was climate change. If you look at these lakes, you think that when it rains, they flood. And you would think like, there's a lot of water in these lakes. In actual sense, there is no water. When it rains, because these lakes are already filled with silts, siltation, there's a lot of, soil, rocks, and, stuff like that comes from hilly areas because of poor farming methods. And when it rains like this, when you have increased rains, like intensive rains, these lakes flood. They flood, and people think there's a lot of water. In actual sense, it's not there, and they displace communities. Yeah, but also if you look at the biodiversity across, near these lakes, it's been destroyed by the increasing population. You see poor fishing methods. Yeah, reducing, catch from these lakes. And yeah, I mean, the situation is not good. But also, there are other solutions-based journalists, journalism stories that we saw in communities living close to these lakes. You find there are some communities, for example, in Uganda that are restoring these lakes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is super interesting. Mercy, I think you were going to jump in there as well.
Yeah, I wanted to, I listened when Frederick mentioned the republication and partnership with some of the local mediums. I wanted to add that, the success story behind, for instance, the project that we did. I'm happy that Fisayo Shoyombo is here. He's the founder of the Foundation for Investigative Journalism. Is one of the most, prominent newsrooms in Nigeria. They were also very instructive in republishing this story. So, right now we have 53 members newsrooms that whenever these kinds of stories are out, they also republish it. Because if you look at it critically, Unbias the News is pretty much two going to 3 years. It's a pretty much new newsroom. And if you've worked in the media landscape, you need at least 10 years, for people to even know your name. But the success of Unbias the News is in its media partners across the world, from Asia to Africa to Europe to America, having major platforms in states, in cities, republishing these stories, gets it into the policymakers, gets the attention of the government, get the attention of the people themselves. I just wanted to add to what Frederick said as well, so I don't miss it. Thank you.
No, it's a really important point. And I think what you've also both really touched on is that the power of the local journalists to whether it's through data, through knowledge, through local understanding, can then be unlocked. And then through the collaborations and the actual additional republication, then that reach can be gained. So actually the commonalities between the countries can be seen more readily. And I think, Frederick, you touched on it, that, this is it is transboundary, right? It's not just even though the local issues are so prevalent and the local journalists can really identify them, actually the climate change is playing out on a global platform, right? So, and that's how these collaborations can be leveraged so well. So yeah, thank you so much for that super interesting work. Lou, please, would you love to share something about that you've been working on, and probably touching on similar points, but maybe something additional as well?
Hi, I'm calling in from Manila, Philippines, where it's peak summer, and Mercy and Frederick are two journalists I aim to be. Like, they're really serious climate journalists because I feel like a baby zygote climate journalist. I just started in 2021 when the IPCC report's headlines read Code Red for Humanity. And my boss saw me go on a full panic mode and rage on social media, just like worrying and panicking about Code Red for Humanity. And then he calmly came up to me and said, "Did you want to take lead on our environment focused documentary series that he was considering with another team?" And so that's how I got into this. I'm very new. And what Mercy and Frederick were saying about tapping local journalists, it's really funny because when we started, it was a makeshift operation that allowed me to realize the power of local journalists. I had the ideas, but I had no team power. I had no manpower. So my boss linked me up to a team that had the manpower, but then they didn't have the budget. And so we really had to source and go local because the story that I wanted to tell was about a fisher folk down south in Mindanao, southernmost of Philippines, and we had no budget to fly a crew. And we really had to look for journalists to be able to produce that story, local journalists. And luckily, we had a good network because we are a TV network in the Philippines, the largest one, and we had good stringers there. And we were able to produce a really, really insightful story. Like for a first timer, I thought that was that was a good foray into journalism, thanks to the local journalists who was able to get the best possible footage and the best possible interviews that we could have. They knew the lay of the land, they spoke the language, the subject easily warmed up to him, and we got what we needed. When we published the video, it generated some more than 10,000 views online, and that's a lot for that type of content. And it allowed our video team to start considering tapping local journalists and going full documentary because of that experience. I'm very very proud of that. There's so much learnings, and it really boiled down to not having the resources and going up against the limits.
Thank you. I was actually wanting to just ask a question to all of you on this. So you've all referenced local journalists and working together in that way. Do you think that the journalists that you have access to have the tools? I know Mercy mentioned training and things like that. Do you think that there's a need to understand some of the more complexities behind the science, behind sort of what's happening in the local communities itself, or do you think the knowledge is there and it's more around translating that into community understanding? So the actual, the journalist knowledge is there, but actually the local community understanding is not there, or is it a mixture of both? It'd be really interesting to see what you think.
Yeah, I could go first. Probably what we may need also to think about is, do the journalists understand collaborative journalism? Do they understand the importance of collaborating? Do they have skills in collaboration, in collaborating with their fellow journalists? But also, how do they feel about collaboration versus competing? Why would they, compete? Do they know what they are writing about? Do they know the significance, the importance of what they are writing about? why would they, or maybe their media houses, compete instead of, collaborating? If they are writing about a transboundary resource, for example, river that crosses, several countries, and they are telling a story of that river, why would they compete? Yeah. So then for me, and I've seen this in most of the, countries in the Nile Basin, media houses, journalists still, prefer to, to compete instead of collaborating, and they don't understand the importance of, collaborating. No, they do not. And there are several, of course, there are several benefits, but also, I have seen, probably the trend is in, kind of increasing. I have seen more journalists going into writing, about climate, about the environment, and you have so many in this field. And as you kind of have like an army of journalists who are there to write about these issues, but they still want to write from their, local perspective, national perspective, instead of, doing like a transboundary, story. Yeah, I mean, these are things that we may need to think about. Yeah.
Thank you. Mercy, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, I wanted to say that, Sharon, you sort of mentioned the two issues and in a way responded as well and answered, I think first, when Louis was speaking, Louis, is that how to pronounce your name? Louis, okay, great. I wanted to mention that, where first I work with Ghostwriter. Ghostwriter is the mother body of Unbias News. So please, whenever you're looking for journalists, just go up there. We have publishers signed up there now, and journalists, any journalist in the world, you can find them there. So yes, you should not, bother much when you have Ghostwriter to fall back to. That's one. To respond to Sharon's question around what helps, I think, to be honest, both concerns that you raised does work, because as if you've been a journalist for, it doesn't matter the beat you cover, even when you cover sports, even when you cover politics, even when you cover climate, which is in itself a subject matter that is very scientific on its own. It's very important to be able to listen to those who have worked their life's experiences is within the sector, and unlearn and relearn and better understand, the instrument of climate reportage. That's one. Secondly, I feel like as journalists need to start demystifying the language of reportage in a way that people understand. There are a lot of communities in my part of the world where you come and say, oh, climate change, everybody goes, oh, and people are, oh, because, sorry, it's an expression, but you get what I mean. People do that because there's a way where we communicate with the global south as though it's we against them, or we're talking to them, and nobody wants to be talked to, and there's also a concern around it's a rather Western narrative that is being pushed down to some parts of the world to adapt to. So within the context of climate change, we need to start deconstructing how we frame it. Because in the course of our project called the Sinking Cities Project, we saw that there were communities in the River Rhine on the coastal part of Lagos that one of our respondents said, or the person our journalist interviewed said, 5 years ago, they had properties in these spaces. Today, it's no longer there. That's a story. So how can we say it in a way where our people understand without the arrogance? And I say arrogance because we come and just say, oh, we just troll. Yes, it's a great buzzword, but we need to find a way where we communicate in the language people are able to understand and speak with them and make them understand that this is our problem. And this is why we're big on local journalists, because there's also the arrogance of who reports the story. When information passes through channels, it's distorted from the messenger to the channels of reportage, even to the delivery itself. So we try to cut short this distortion and try to ensure that this message goes in smoothly and gets to the avenue where it needs to get to. Who is talking to the people? And are we speaking to the people and reinterpreting what they say, or giving them the mic to also own their voices and feel like, okay, this is my story, I want to tell it. So there's all of that arrogance that happens when we talk about climate change, that the global north or the global south is saying, please go to hell. That's nonsense. Climate change is not my problem. Of course, it's our problem. We're seeing we're seeing what's happening. It's hitting up. This year's summer, I don't know how many of us are going to survive without air conditioners in our homes. That's a typical story of climate change. How then should we start reporting it so that everybody understands and comes around to embrace this conversation in a way that it's not a north or south problem. Rather, it's a global problem for our humanity to understand and to also say, you know what has the West done in its own industrialization, and owning up to that argument and taking responsibility for it, rather than say, oh, the global north, not you are the problem. How many bridges do we have in the global north that it becomes a problem? How many industries do we have in the global north that is also the problem? So we need to be able to try to deconstruct these conversations, and people who have also contributed to where we are, own up to it, acknowledge it, take responsibility for their actions before we can also move forward as a global community in this conversation.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying. Just, the thing about relevancy and accountability, I think those two points we'll touch on later in our conversation, but they are like the essential points that we're talking about, that whole, people need to be accountable for what is also being reported, but also for how communities are absorbing information. And then also, to your point, so perfectly put, Mercy, around how do we make those the context of the stories relevant to people in those communities, so everyone can understand what is going on in a way that it affects their life. It's not just something very abstract that we see reported in a certain way. So thank you for that. We're going to open up a poll now to people. The question is going to be posted now, but it's basically, do you feel your local community has something to say about climate? So if you just say yes, no, or don't know, the poll is up on the screen. It really is an interesting question, because as was touched on by the panel, the subject of how climate is reported is quite a hot topic. And do people in the community, are they engaged in it? Is it something that they have a voice on? And it looks like that there is a unanimous 95 saying, yes, we do think that the local community has something to say. So what I would love to pose to the panel is then, how do you start to find the community voices and find what people want to talk about? How do you start to go into the community and work with them to extract the stories of relevancy and to get those local voices heard in a way that, as we just spoke about, has context but also global reach? So Frederick, I don't know whether you maybe want to take this one first.
Yeah, I want to go fast. Yeah, I'll probably give you some of the examples that we've done. What we found that was so useful and impactful, of course, was taking back stories. Taking back the stories. For example, we did a project on photography, and where we supported journalists across the Nile. And later, when the project was done, when the journalists had taken photos, climate change stories, or what was happening to the river, we took back the photos to the communities, because we strongly believe that these stories live in areas where they are made, and not in newspapers or online or on radio, but where they are made. If, for example, you did a map, you mapped these stories, that's the map, that's the area where they live, where they were made. So we took back the stories, and we realized that local communities at first had actually not participated. They feared. They thought probably the journalists were spies, were government officials, so they never talked. But when you take back the story, you have made, and you take it back to the community, then community members see themselves in these stories. They see themselves in the photos, and they are able to identify, this is Mercy, this is Louis. And so they know you. They feel they are part of the thing. They are part of the story. So then they open up again and give you more. In actual sense, this guy, the places where we went, they actually called us and said, please come back. We have more stories. We had not told you this because we thought you'd report us to the government, but now we think you are good. So probably you may need to underline community engagement, and community engagement can be like that. Like media house can engage the community, not waiting for the NGOs, for the government to, to engage the community. But also, we may need to underline the having voices of the communities, making sure that you work with journalists who are able to go to the ground and get local communities voices. Remember, climate change affects the local man, the local woman, and they are the ones who feel the effects. If, for example, the farmers are not able to plant because, it's been a dry season, so then they are the ones that are feeling the impact. I mean, they are the ones that would feel they wouldn't have enough food to eat. They're not able to plant. They're not able to, for example, raise money to take their kids to school. They're feeling the impact. So then we can have the local voices. Let the story be told by the local man who is affected, by the local woman who is affected, who's not able to get water for his family. So yeah, I mean that's the thing. But also what I realized that is important is the use of local data, and research. We have a project called Nileware that works, that brings journalists and scientists together. So it's kind of like we co-produce knowledge, scientists and journalists. So then we work with local researchers who generate local data. They are the ones who have done research in local communities. And in most cases, this is local data that is affecting that village. I mean, data on what is affecting that village. For example, how many trees have been cut in that village. So if you engage local data, you'll be, in position to have those local voices, but also you attract the local reader, because the local reader will be like, this is our well, which dried up. So then tomorrow they will come back to you because they know you're going to give them what they want. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting what you just said about taking the story back to them so that they can see themselves in the story. And then to your point, they open up more and then that trust is built. So actually you become a trusted ally for the community and for the interest group. And I think, have you seen that trust when you've built it with communities? I think you touched on it, that they come back and want to work with you more. Is that would you say that's the case?
Yeah, well, trust can be built differently. That's one of building trust. The other one is, being ethical. Even when you do the story professionally, when you write the story and they see themselves, they read about themselves, they know that you are representing them fairly well. Yeah, so then you build trust. But also, when you take stories back to the communities, you're building trust because they start looking at you as their friend, as part of them, not an enemy. Remember, like I told you in the beginning, they will be like, these are spies. They just want to take information from us. But then when they see themselves in the stories, you build trust.
Lou, you are nodding your head. Have you had experience of this as well?
Yeah, actually, I'm fresh off reporting about drought. There's a water crisis down south again in Mindanao, and I was listening to the unedited stories, to the unedited interview, and our interviewees kept saying, "Thank you so much for shining light on our story." They kept thanking us in the interview, and I thought that was strange, but I think reporting about those issues, about those communities, is really, really great. But I think more importantly, giving them a platform to report about their problems is even more important, maybe, and I think maybe even better. And then you try to locate those stories in the bigger context of climate change, because as both the esteemed panelists have said, climate change is a transboundary problem.
Do you think when you take the stories back and they feel that they've heard, or as you said so beautifully, thank you for shining a light on the subject, do you think there's a hope or an understanding or a belief that actually they can have some impact on the climate situation and they feel more empowered? Do you think that's an important part of the dialogue, or is it more around just being heard? Do you think there's an element of that impacting the outcome is important and the solution is important too?
I think listening to them, I think it was really about being heard, getting the platform and getting their stories out there on a bigger national scale.
Mercy, do you think the
But
same?
also,
Yeah, I just okay.
yeah.
I just wanted to flag that when you repeat a situation over time, there seems to be distrust. Why are we having a trust conversation? Because the communities have concerns around how they've been projected in the media over time. That's the big elephant in the room. And in most communities in the South, again, I keep referencing the global South for obvious reasons, it's how we've had this, neo-colonial media narrative where mainstream media visits locals, reports the locals as they, them, refer to them as these people, not us, not people who have lived experiences or sufferings, but rather people who are predominantly looking like that. And it has happened over time. And when the climate topics and the climate conversation started, these communities had to say, wait a minute. We've seen, this is a replica of what we've seen over time. If you've reported people in 100 years and there's a way they are projected in the media, there are going to be concerns about this, how they're projected, which is why when Frederick was mentioning, he clearly said that if they see themselves in the news and they're represented, well, of course, they want to be able to come and express themselves and say, this is how it is. Nobody wants to be there to be harvested. Over time, mainstream media keeps harvesting news. They're not interested in development strides of some of these communities we're mentioning. They just want to come and look at the breaking news. Is it war? Okay, great, super. Take it out, go, drop it. Is it disaster? Great, take it out, drop it. Is it pandemic? Okay, just profiling people that are probably looking sickly, tired, hungry. That's what makes story. But that's not what makes story. We need to start looking at the development indices. We need to be interested in ensuring that these communities thrive and also prosper. When we start doing that, then the trust, we get to enhance the trust. We also need to also project what these people are saying in a light where we don't come with an agenda. What is the agenda of some of our media houses? The agenda is to say, we have a pre-colonial agenda to be able to project the third world. And I don't like using that term, but again, that's the term they call some part of the world. The third world nations for a particular reason, and there's an in-house style that dictates how these stories are being written or how these stories are told. We need to be able to talk to communities as though they are living experiences, they are humans and not just numbers. We need to reflect their plight and tell their stories in a way where we allow them to also do the talking. We also allow them also do the talking in terms of the representation of the journalist who does the talking. Not flying somebody from DC to go to my mother's village to tell me better stories about my community that my father or my great-grandfather has lived there all his lives. You know what I'm saying? They are journalists in these places. Rather than coming there and say, oh, you're a journalist. Oh, that's beautiful. Can you work for me as a fixer? And we call them fixer. We tell them to follow us around the city and they add 2-3 things to the stories and we give them $200 and we say, great. Then we fly back to DC and tell this created perfect story. And you want to come back to the community to do the same and you expect them to believe you when you come with a new conversation, even when it concerns them. So it's about also the dignity of these people. So when we talk about trust, you need to build it. You need to work with the community. You need to ensure that the term fixer is dismantled because it was created as a structural barrier by the media. If you can work with me as a fixer, why can't I tell the story?
Frederick, I saw you nodding along with that quite.
Yeah. Well, just to answer what you had asked, when local communities come to us with their ideas, their feedback, their stories, they expect us as journalists, as media houses, to work as bridges like you're a bridge. So then they know you are gonna reach their MP, member of parliament. You maybe this story is gonna be read by the president. So they feel that you probably are part of the solution. Yeah. So then they tell you because they think you as a journalist, you have no capacity to, do stuff, but you can help work as a bridge, take the story to the local leader, to the member of parliament. So then that member of parliament can also advocate for, policies or, stuff like that, that will help them mitigate or adapt to climate change. Yeah, so that's the thing. Well, for me, I think they don't just come to tell us a story and go home and sleep, but again, they even wait. You go back to the community and they say, but you remember you came here, I told you stuff, nothing has been done. So then they are actually questioning your capacity to take that stuff to their leader or someone who is able to give them a solution. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that cyclical piece is to your point about building trust. It really is about that you've also got the capacity to understand, to represent, to hear, but then also to make change. And I think that those sort of, that cyclical thing does encourage trust and does encourage collaboration. So, and then especially when it's amplified in a global space, in a really honest and authentic way, becomes a very compelling proposition to keep the dialogue going. So really, I really appreciate the challenges in that. I'd like to ask the audience again another poll question, which is it fits into this quite well. It's do you feel your publication or your organization understands and represents its local community on matters of climate change? I think that's quite an interesting question, just based off what we were talking about. So do we actually understand and represent the challenges that are affecting communities well, or do we not really understand perhaps what is going on? And while that poll is coming up, I would love it if we could move on to around how journalists and media can better collaborate to report on the needs of communities. I know you all have a list of best practices and lessons that you've experienced because of your work. So I was wondering if you could share some of those in terms of what you've learned in terms of collaboration and really extracting teams that can work super well together. I know, Frederick, you highlighted some of the issues that potentially can happen about collaboration. So how have you navigated those? I mean, Lou, if you could go first, that would be fabulous on that question.
For us, collaboration is really super important because both Frederick and Mercy mentioned earlier, climate change is really transboundary, so it really affects everybody and it will affect all facets of our lives. So I feel like climate change should not be siloed to a particular desk or a particular division in the newsrooms. So collaborating with different desks is really important to me. Like I said earlier, when I started, it was really a makeshift operation, and um, I was getting pulling people from different teams to be able to tell stories of solutions from communities. So that proved to be very important. But also another is which leads me to my next point. I think another important factor in collaboration in climate is that everybody, even managers and especially managers, be trained in climate reporting, learn about the science so that nothing gets lost in translation. I think both Mercy and Frederick also pointed out the importance of language and being able to dismantle and demystify what climate change is or whatever that is, and be able to speak it directly, um, and not be arrogant, to use Mercy's words earlier, not be arrogant about climate reporting. I think that's very important. I think, yeah, climate change training because it will affect all beats. So, for instance, sports may not know anything about climate, but they have to know it because sooner or later there will not be any Winter Olympics, you know? Um, or entertainment needs to know about climate so that when stars start talking about how it's unseasonably hot where they are, then they can follow through with context. So I think that's very important.
So just a question on training. So there are quite a lot of climate trainings out there. What do you think is sort of a necessity in terms of collaborative climate training? Because it is slightly nuanced in terms of, to Frederick's point before around, you know, getting those collaborations together. It's a different ask, right? It's a different shift mentally. It's like we actually need to work together on this so we can actually produce the best solutions and really find ways to impact the conversation. So what sort of training would you wish for in terms of this space, or is already out there that you know is great?
I even attending these types of conversations and workshops, I think is important already. Like getting select members of teams and attend such workshops is good. I know AFP has workshops, also online workshops that they offer. Several other organizations, I think, have the same thing. So at even if, for instance, I'm the only one who will attend, I think knowledge sharing within the news desk, within the newsroom, is really really important. And it's not just from the top down. I feel like even bottom up should be. It's got to be a two-way. It's got to be a two-way street.
Frederick, I see you nodding along.
I just wanted to contribute to the question that I've just asked and the bigger question that you asked before. For me, I think the journalists already have the skills to write the stories about climate change, but also then they don't have skills to collaborate. And one of this, probably, maybe now I will go to the bigger one. One of the stuff that they need to learn is how to be a leader for the team, like leadership skills. See, for a team to collaborate, must have a leader. It must have someone who will coordinate, how to coordinate the journalists. Yeah, so you find journalists know they have skills in writing stories, but they don't know how to bring themselves together. So then they work in different areas, and then they don't have skills to bring themselves together. But also, do they have skills to look at a theme running through? Yeah, so then we may need to give them skills to critically look at these stories and find a theme running through. So then they know that if I'm collaborating with John, Henry, and someone, then this is the theme that we are working on. It's not the same story, not the same wording, not the same stuff, but it is a theme. So you have stories coming in. Yeah, so then you take a bigger picture. So I just wanted to give like a model, the model that we are using. We first identify a theme of common importance that is cross-cutting. Yeah, so then when you have that one, then we again source for credible data that is going to feed into that support probably our hypothesis. So we look for the credible data, and then you find that already you have something there that journalists are going to write about from different countries, from different regions. They already have local data. They already have a theme. So then now you can call them. You can, send out a call for pitches. So then journalists start writing about that theme using local data. So then it's just one thing running through, which I think that journalists do not understand. They know how to write the stories, but they may not understand. But also, see, if after all this process, after writing these stories, journalists may end up publishing them in their media houses. So then they have a local perspective. But you need, again, someone who will put these stories together, like the leader, for example, to call Jane, James, and Henry and say, now that you're done with the stories, can I go through them as an editor or something like that, and put these stories together and have a regional version of the stories. So you have local and then regional. So you have a bigger picture. Yeah, so you look at stories from a regional, from an international perspective, not a local perspective. Yeah, but also these stories have a local perspective. Remember, they are written by local journalists. Yeah.
Yeah. I love what you're saying, because then if you look at the credibility of the data, it comes from local sources which also understand community, if I'm understanding correctly, and then you take that and you can bring that up to a regional level, of which then the thread becomes the compelling piece of information that can be the collaboration tool, and then from there then the impact can be proven and seen. So I think it's a really interesting perspective. Do you think the data and having data is an essential piece to this puzzle? So it's grounded in something.
Yeah. So when we tell these stories, the main, well, I mean, the local stories, we want local communities to take, like you'd say, scientific decisions based on science. Based on science, and this is science, I mean, done by researchers, by the guys who produce data. So then when they're taking decisions, the local communities and local leaders, it's based on researched stuff. So then for me, I strongly believe that local data is very important. It's kind of localizes the story and gives it a perspective, but also brings in science. So then the decision taken by local communities is not based on politics, like propaganda, but it's based on data produced by a researcher who's been in the community, and he knows exactly what has been happening, and then things can be done scientifically, not politically.
No, I that's a really important perspective. Thank you. Mercy, do you have anything to share on this?
I think based on the conversations around data is that, we don't want to do a report that, is not fact-based. And with data, you're able to have you're going to be reporting from an informed place. You're not making opinionated statements that are not verifiable. And people lie. Numbers don't, like they say, right? And if you are able to make explainers that are visible enough for the people to see. So for instance, in communities like a city like Lagos with 22 million, estimated 22 million people, and you go to a community where there are probably 50,000 or 1 million, you are able to project all of this and explain to them how much impact, the sea level rise and the cost for them, in numbers, in actual numbers, so they can see that. It helps to tell even much better stories. I think data is very crucial in climate reportage, and it should be at the center, of any kind of report concerning climate change.
Yeah, I think if I'm hearing correctly, it also is it gives the story and the reporting a backbone to then be able to take to policymakers, to other communities, and actually start to have some viability for impact. So I think at that point it starts to ladder up and become really important, both locally and then regionally and then globally too. So I think,
absolutely.
Yeah, super.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We're going to just do the last poll, and then we're going to enter on to talk about relevancy and trust. So the last poll for everyone is, do you think local ideas and solutions from the community would convert into engaging local climate change reporting? The reason why we wanted to touch on this question, and it comes back a little bit to the point about trust, but really it's around optimism, and how do you start to put optimistic reporting into the world. So there's a lot of generation dread that's happening. There's a lot of fear and doom around climate reporting. People are not necessarily trusting businesses around their climate actions. And there's, you know, a lot of anxiety that's building around this. So, you know, when we often look at, you know, what grabs the front page of the screen or what people are reading or eyeballs, and it's often negative, and perhaps not a climate story. Maybe to your point, it's a political story, or it's something that is more shock orientated. So what I'd love to just sort of discuss with you all is how do you sort of create the optimistic news is worth reporting? How do you actually start to put optimistic climate journalism into the world, and how do you start to prove that it will encourage more proactive, positive coverage, and therefore potentially more engagement from communities if we start doing this? Or you have a totally different opinion and it doesn't. But Frederick, would you like to take that question first?
Yeah. Well, over the years that I've been reporting about climate, I've realized that, you know, it's very important to tell you know, solutions-based you know, stories that, you know, build hope for the communities. But also, I have realized that a story can grow old. Like a story can grow old, like a climate change story can grow old. How do you resurrect the story? You see, it's kind of, and I'm not saying this is what I'm doing, and I'm not saying it's right, but it is something that you can think about. How do you resurrect the story? I mean, the story of climate change has been there for, you know, so many decades, over 20 years. And you realize that if you go to a local community and you talk to a farmer, he knows he's not going to plant because it's the dry season. You know, it's hot, He will tell you, it's hot, I cannot plant. And why? Because, you know, climate has changed. They know how to put this stuff in their local languages. And yeah, so then sometimes they don't want to hear about climate change. But how do you resurrect the story? I have seen several journalists, you know, sticking to reporting about catastrophic events, because they kind of resurrect the story, and you'll be like, oh my God, floods. Oh my God. So then we should not cut down trees. You realize. But for me, I think, yeah, I think that's not the right way to do it, but of course it can be done. And I've seen it work, because you have to somehow scare communities to take action. But it kind of creates, like you can say, and you can see through, it kind of creates climate fatigue, you know, like, you know, a sense of hopelessness. People are like, we are doomed, we're gonna die. What should we do? Yeah, we're gonna die. I mean, even if I planted, or, you know, stuff like that, I mean, it has no meaning. Yeah, so then that's why I strongly believe that reporting more like on government failures, you know, and, you know, stuff like the floods, you know, the dry season, the droughts, it kind of creates climate fatigue, and you find communities kind of worried. But we may need to come in as journalists to bring in, to talk up, to write about innovative solutions. Communities are, you know, taking innovative solutions, you know, to adapt, to mitigate effects of climate change. For example, I've seen so many cities in Africa, you know, going to solar. They are lighting streets, you know, using solar panels. Yeah, these are stories that we can take. For example, I have seen streets in Africa, you know, I mean, cities in Africa create walkways. It's a small story that you may not think about, like walkways. So they encourage more people to walk instead of, you know, driving. Yeah, I mean, it creates a bigger. It's a small story, but it has a bigger effect. So such a stories inspire action. Inspire action. You're like, someone has done that. You can also do it. Yeah. So for me, I'm into, you know, stories that inspire action, stories that are, you know, around innovative solutions, but not the other side. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Lou, you're nodding. You're nodding. Do you believe the same? Because I mean, there's that question around sort of, you know, we know optimistic stories can inspire hope, but will they actually, to your point, Frederick, do they actually then combat climate fatigue? Like, is it a way to do that? Lou, what do you think?
I think reporting about solutions and giving voices to communities, I think it just completes the entire climate coverage. It completes the doom and I mean, it's important. You have to say, you have to report about the problems, and yada yada. That it's what happened to me, but the gloom, the doom and gloom. But and that's the reason why I decided I want to do a proactive documentary series about solutions, because you cannot get stuck in the doom and gloom. I mean, the panic and the and the anxiety, they're real. So I feel like reporting on solutions allows for a more comprehensive climate report, and especially if you end it with solutions that there's something you can do, then you can really, really elicit hope and positivity.
Mercy, do you feel the same?
Absolutely. I just, just to add to what my other colleagues have said, is that if we are following the trends, if we're all following the data, if you work in the newsroom or you are connected to the newsroom like I am connected based on the work I do, you see that there's a growing news avoidance. And the more the general populace is avoiding the news, it shows us, it points us to something. When there's a problem, we shouldn't sit on it. We follow the patterns, follow the trends. Why do we have news avoidance? Why do we have people who are saying that they're no longer interested in the news? Yesterday or a day before yesterday, I read a study that people spend more time with games on the New York Times app than they do with news. The New York Times app was supposed to be a news app for people to read the news, but guess what? Because they have a gaming product as part of the app, people are going to the games rather than the app. So if the New York Times, that has a very good quality journalism, good quality storytelling, whatever quality you want to describe it, their stories are uptight. People are not interested in reading them. As people who are in the news, all I need to do, or our panelists and our audience here, all you need to do to get your vox populi is to ask everybody, do you like to listen to the news? The feedback will give you the answers that you want to hear. And if you get that feedback, it should be able to give us informed decisions on how best we need to take a step back away from polarization, take a step back away from sensationalism, take a step back away from the bad news. When I was in journalism school, they used to say, the bad news, of course, is the news. But now we're seeing the consequence of that. People are no longer interested in tuning to the news. When you ask people, have you watched the news today? They say, why? They ask you why. Because if you say we're all going to die anyway, what's the point, And people are also dealing with internal problems. There's a mental health pandemic going around across the world. And then the news is overwhelmingly, suffocating us with all of the channels from Twitter to Instagram. I mean, the tech companies already have their own bites to take out of this. But what I'm trying to say in essence is that as people who work in the news, we need to be able to create news content that is not as sensational as we saw news or how we were introduced into journalism. We need to unlearn how we tell the stories. We need to be able to also go to young people that are no longer interested in news. The Reuters Institute did an interesting study that everybody should probably go read about how we have a whole generation of young people who don't watch the news. They're on TikTok. How do we get them to listen to climate conversation and break down the conversation in a way that is exciting enough that an 8-year-old will see the story and say, oh, okay, this is not so much of a story, but looks fun, but it threatens our entire existence if we all do not take action. So we need to be able to start going into info kind of conversations that help people to understand, rather than allowing the political elites to polarize all our space. because you're either the left or you're the right. There's no in between. Like everybody's just shouting and nobody's listening. There's noise. You know, we need to step back from the noise and be able to create content that is exciting enough for people to be able to listen. Because when I'm excited, then I listen. When I listen, then I understand. When I understand, then perhaps I'll take action.
Yeah, that's exactly, it's perfectly said. It's really how do you start to engage people where they are, and in ways that they really want to engage back with you, which is kind of where we started this, around how do you actually start to get people represented and local voices heard in a way that people, you know, trust and want to believe in. We've got approximately 4 minutes left, and I just wanted to ask each of you, if you wanted to leave our audience with one little nugget about community and collaboration, what would your little sound bite be that, you know, maybe something to take away, to think about, to how to collaborate? Yeah, just one little snippet of additional brilliance would be a wonderful way to end this. Whoever wishes to go first.
I think that we should stop competing. Rather, we should partner. Okay. Competition has been the trust of the media and newsrooms over time, but it's shown that it has not helped us for development strides. If we want to do reportage that helps our global community to survive, or our species to survive the next decade and more, we need to see that working together is the only option on the table and not competing. I think that would be my one-liner. And competing does not undermine what you do. Sorry, a partnership does not undermine what you do. Rather, we are all out here for impact, and that is the goal. And as long as we can put our heads together and get it done, we should go get it done, because we cannot, working in isolation, we've seen that it has not worked.
I love that. Partnership, not competition. Thank you, Mercy. Lou, Frederick?
Yeah. So the first thing that for me, I'm speaking to journalists. The first thing that you may need to think about is the significance of the story, the importance of the story you're going to write about. Think about the story, not what what you're gonna get out, for example, money or stuff like that. But why are you writing this story? What is the importance of writing this story? If you know why you're writing it, then you'll even look at collaboration as the easiest way to achieve what you want to achieve. But also to the journalists, there is no one who is going to teach you all this stuff you're talking about. You're going to teach it yourself. I mean, stuff is there online, YouTube, but also practice will make you a perfect person.
Thank you so much. That's totally true. I love that. Thank you. Lou?
I think they say hope is a product of action. So I feel like it's really, really important we do not get stuck in the doom and gloom. Like, even for journalists, because we keep hearing journalism is dying, we have no budget. There's just too many limitations. And I feel like we cannot get stuck in the doom and gloom. And we just have to, when we act on the problems, when we look for solutions, I feel like that's where we can find hope. And that also speaks not just for journalism, but for the climate crisis also.
Amazing. Thank you so much to all of you for this great conversation. We super appreciate your time and energy, and hopefully we addressed a lot of the questions, and if we haven't, then hopefully we'll get to them in additional webinars or podcasts or other conversations like this. So thank you once again, Lou, Mercy, Frederick. It was an absolute pleasure, and we will see you soon. Thank you.